Hey guys, I'm starting something a bit new today. As you may have heard after watching me kind of talk about this, I've been reading a lot of nonfiction lately. And a lot of the nonfiction books that are published get made into documentaries, or at least have documentaries made about the same subject material. I've been really lucky to find a whole series of books, by different authors that have been made into documentaries by the BBC, and because I'm an old lady with an Acorn account, I've been watching them and comparing them to the books that I've been reading. And I'm not sure who else is going to be interested in this, but it's been really interesting to me to see the different ways that these documentaries have been created out of the source material. And it's about history and it's stuff that I'm interested in, so I'm going to be making a series of reviews that are books to documentaries. So pretty self-explanatory, right? Again, I know that this is way different than the usual YA content that I do, and I will be getting back to that, but right now, this is where I'm at. So today I am going to be doing a huge review on two books and two documentaries, and they are The Plantagenets and The War of the Roses by Dan Jones. The reason that I'm doing the reviews together is because the documentaries that were also made off of these were translated into kind of related but not related documentaries, and the books themselves are related but not related. And I think that next to each other, they kind of talk a lot about what I want to say about documentaries in general. So, what do I mean by that? Let me explain. So first off, for the first book review, there's The Plantagenets. This is the first book in the series. The subtitle of this is The Warrior Kings and Queens Who Made England. And the Plantagenets, for some reason, the Tudor dynasty is sometimes the most famous one that's come out of, British history because of Henry VIII. But the Plantagenets are this dynasty of rulers who just, it boggles your mind, the stuff in this that these people really did to each other and the things that happened in their lives and the circumstance and the happenstance. And it's just you think that after, this one king, okay, that was crazy, now let's have some downtime. No, it's just one thing after another after another. If you try to write fiction, some kind of big epic fantasy fiction about this, people would be like, you can't do that. I'm sorry. It's insane. There's just so much crazy stuff that happens. It starts to become almost too much to believe. I really love Dan Jones' writing. I think that he mixes fact with literature very well. I think that he creates a book that's readable, but also feels like you're being educated. Sometimes nonfiction can go really too far one way or the other. Sometimes it can get a little bit too narrative, which is what I found with Robert K. Massey's Catherine the Great, or it can get too factoidal. And that's a funny word. Anyways, and I really found that Dan Jones as a writer is one of the best for the middle ground of that, and I've really enjoyed his books, and I, without a doubt, just went and picked up both of these books. The Plantagenets covers a lot more ground than The War of the Roses, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. And there are some really important things that happen here, like the Magna Carta, Eleanor of Aquitaine, how the dynasty started in the first place. There is just so much information jam-packed into this, and each chapter after each chapter just feels like you're rolling along in history. And I definitely got the sense with this book that I would be interested in learning a little bit more in depth about some of the rulers. There's only so much you can cover in a book this size about, I think, 10 or 11 Plantagenet kings. So it's a lot. It's a lot of information, and it's jam-packed and it's crazy, but the Plantagenets really are the most amazing dynasty ever to rule England, and what they did and what they won and what they lost, and their wives and their families, and it's just crazy. So if you're interested in reading something about them in a very concise and interesting format, this book, hardcore, is where you should go. The War of the Roses, The Fall of the Plantagenets, and the Rise of the Tudors kind of sort of picks up where this book leaves off. This book, and by this book I mean this one. The Plantagenets stops around the reign of Henry IV, or Henry Bolingbroke, who took the throne from Richard II. And then this book starts after the death of Henry V, who is Henry IV's son, the hero of Agincourt. And that's because it's really Henry V's son, Henry VI, that brings about the War of the Roses. So if you wanted to learn about Henry Bolingbroke and Henry V, you will have to find some kind of a filler book in the middle, because this one goes from Henry VI to Henry Tudor, Henry VII, and kind of sort of into Henry VIII, although just like the beginning of his reign and the aftermath of the War of the Roses. This book gets into a lot more detail than the Plantagenets, just because while the Plantagenets was trying to deal with like 11 kings, the War of the Roses was really only the reign of 4 kings, and a couple of them flip-flopped back and forth a couple of times, but it really isn't as long of a struggle as I think we think of it as in popular opinion. There were technically 5 kings during the War of the Roses. So first Henry VI is king, and then Edward IV is king, and then Edward VI is king again, and then Edward IV is king again, and then Edward's son, Edward V, is king for like a hot moment before his uncle, Richard III, kills him and his brother in the Tower basically and takes the throne. And then the War of the Roses ends when Richard III is killed by Henry Tudor or Henry VII. So yes, it's crazy, but it doesn't take place over as long of a period of time as one might think, based on like popular mythology. So this one gets to dive a lot deeper into daily details and like little details about kingdoms and politics and stuff like that. But all delivered with Dan Jones's normal like literary flow. So I definitely liked this one, I think, more than the Plantagenets, because I felt like I was being able to dive really deeply into each king and the politics and the people around them that kind of pushed and pulled their way through the War of the Roses, and how many people flip-flop sides, and it's just kind of insane. And then also how like he portrays the rise of Henry Tudor in conjunction with the fall of Richard III. I thought that was really well done and executed very well. So I think I liked this one better than the Plantagenets, although for me they're both 4-star books, because they were just fun to read and I feel like I learned a lot, which is really the 2 basic things that I want out of my nonfiction. When these were made into documentaries, the Plantagenets was made into a documentary called Britain's Bloodiest Dynasty, the Plantagenets, and the War of the Roses was the same thing, Britain's Bloodiest War. And that right there tells you a little bit of how I feel those documentaries sensationalize the story. And backing up to they're both 4-part series, which I think automatically kind of fails the Plantagenets book, because in 4 episodes, 4, hour-long episodes, you can't get through 11 Plantagenet kings. It's not possible. So they skip around, and they really are only telling the most salacious stories and kind of focusing on, the battles and the bloodshed and the revenge and the ill will that happened during some of these Plantagenet kings' reigns. And yes, while that's true, I think that it skews representation of the Plantagenets as not really being great kings, or not really being capable of providing peace for the realm, which is very untrue. They did have periods of peace, or whatever passes for peace in medieval England, in between all of these crazy battles. And, because it's like this thing after this thing, any period of time that was peaceful, even during the reign of like bad kings, is smushed and kind of erased. And there's definitely a really big element of showmanship to Dan Jones's documentaries. He narrates both of them, and he definitely knows how to create a very cinematic experience, and the recreations and the reenactments are done very well. But especially for the Plantagenets, it just feels like, whoa, man, like this is really sensationalized. I still like it, but like, for instance, the documentary entirely skips Edward I, who's known as the Hammer of the Scots, and he was this really amazing general and king, and he did all these amazing things, and like, it totally skips him over in favor of dedicating an episode to his son, Edward II, who was a very weak king, and has one of like the most grisly death stories in history. Basically, the story goes that he died by having a hot poker shoved up his butt, because he was ridiculed for potentially being gay. And so one of the things I will say about the Dan Jones documentary is that there's a couple of kings who were ridiculed for potentially being gay or having homosexual relationships, and Dan Jones is just like, in the book and in the documentaries, just says like there's no proof of whether or not they were gay. Whether or not they were gay did not make them bad kings. It's these decisions that they made, and these could have been made whether they were gay or straight. It has nothing to do with it. So I really appreciated that though they were sensationalized, there was definitely an element to some of the stories that could have gone like way over the top, and Dan Jones was just like, no, not going that far. The War of the Roses documentary is way better, and way more together, just because since there basically were the 4 kings during the War of the Roses, you can dedicate one episode in each 4-part series to each of those kings and their story. It, of course, there's always an element of documentaries where it leaves out a lot of the nuance and a lot of the personal dynamic and focuses on telling one story about one person, which definitely I think happened during like Edward IV, for instance. He was way more complicated and not the shining knight that I think it portrays him to be. But in terms of telling a cohesive story, a cohesive whole, and like being able to follow a progression of events that get complicated and more complicated and get crazier as you get towards like, the 3rd episode is Richard III and the Princess in the Tower, and then the 4th episode is Henry Tudor, and also really much about his mother, Margaret Beaufort. So again, very sensationalized, very focused on the battles and the bloodiness of the battles and how many people died and how much fighting there was. And so you have to remember that in between all of this, there actually was long periods of peace, both for the Plantagenet dynasty as a whole and also for the War of the Roses, believe it or not. But I do recommend these documentaries. I just think that the Plantagenets documentary shouldn't have been made into a 4-part series, and maybe both of them shouldn't have been quite bloodily sensationalized. But I love them both. I have read both books now. I have watched both documentary series a couple of times, and while there are definitely details left out, as long as you take the documentaries with a grain of salt, there is some stuff to be learned there and a bunch of really interesting stories to hear. Because again, Dan Jones isn't making up these events. He might be like telling them very theatrically, but he isn't making them up. All of this is real and it's crazy and intense. And I really, really like Dan Jones as a writer and as a presenter, and I look forward to whatever he does next. This video has been super long because I was trying to get through so much material, and of course there's way more I could say, so if you want to ask any questions or interact with me, please do so down in the comments. My next ones of these will not be nearly as involved because I'll be doing one book to one documentary, so don't be scared. But I hope that this was at least vaguely interesting to you. Or maybe not, maybe just me. That's fine, that's okay. Anyways, if you are interested in Plantagenet and War of the Roses history, please read Dan Jones's books. If you don't want to read the books, I recommend the documentaries as long as you understand that they are very theatrical and sensationalized. That's the bottom line.